April 1945, a displaced persons camp near Regensburg, Germany. Rain beats down on sagging canvas tents and muddy gravel pathways. Inside a wooden administrative shack, a mountain of fresh wool blankets sits locked behind iron mesh wiring, while outside, shivering children press their faces against the cold window glass. A heavy padlock snaps shut on a crate of tinned meat, sealing away the afternoon rations. A hand puts down a falsified ledger book. A deal is made in whispers. A desperate mother trades her last silver ring just to secure a single loaf of stale bread for her feverish daughter. It is a quiet, systematic theft of human dignity carried out by the very men wearing the patch of the liberators. But a single thick dossier is already moving up the chain of command. General George S. Patton will soon discover exactly what his own men are doing behind those guarded gates, and his response will completely shatter the corrupt empire they built in the mud. This is the story of what Patton did when he discovered American soldiers exploiting refugees they were supposed to protect. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what soldiers found that changed them forever. Clara Johansson was a 30-year-old Swedish national working as an inspector for the International Red Cross. She grew up in Stockholm, where her father taught international law, a background that gave her a fierce belief in objective rules. When the war tore across Europe, she refused to sit safely at home, volunteering instead to enter the ruined landscapes of Germany to protect the absolute most vulnerable. She had spent the last 18 months walking through dozens of primitive, mud-slicked displaced persons camps, learning to read the subtle body language of deep human trauma. She knew how to look past the official records and see the truth. She noticed immediately when the local women refused to make eye contact with uniforms, and she saw how the young children flinched whenever an American vehicle drove past the front gates. She spent 3 long, exhausting days quietly conducting interviews in freezing tents, counting mismatched ration crates, and developing photographs of empty lard buckets. That thick, documented stack of papers in her leather satchel was what brought her to the headquarters building. Captain Frank Morrison was a 34-year-old officer from Jacksonville, Florida, currently serving as the commander of the local American Quartermaster Detachment. Before the war, he operated a small, aggressive commercial lumber business, a job where he learned to view every single transaction through the hard lens of profit and leverage. He believed that the chaos of victory belonged entirely to the winners, often telling his subordinates that the displaced people in the camp were lucky to be alive and should be deeply grateful for whatever scraps they received. Morrison enjoyed the considerable, unearned privileges of his rank, sleeping in a dry, heavily insulated personal quarter that contained 3 stolen cases of high-end Scotch whiskey, 2 tailored fur coats, and a velvet box filled with confiscated gold jewelry. He viewed the 600 starving Eastern European refugees under his direct charge, not as human beings under his protection, but as a private fiefdom to be exploited for personal enrichment and dark favors. He was standing right next to the locked supply fence when the Red Cross inspector confronted him. By April of 1945, the entire landscape of Western Europe was a scene of total administrative collapse. The German war machine was completely shattered, leaving a massive vacuum where an entire civilization used to stand. Millions of displaced civilians, forced laborers, and concentration camp survivors were suddenly wandering the ruined, muddy roads, looking for food, shelter, and their missing families. The rapid advance of the Allied armies meant that frontline combat units were constantly moving forward, leaving the immense burden of civilian administration to smaller, rear-echelon supply detachments. These isolated units operated with almost no direct supervision from higher headquarters, creating an environment ripe for corruption. In the chaotic transition from total war to fragile peace, Army regulations were often treated as optional suggestions by undisciplined officers. who believed they were beyond the reach of military justice. Many high-ranking commanders simply chose to look the other way when minor supply irregularities occurred, prioritizing the tactical movement of fuel and ammunition over the internal welfare of civilian refugees. They considered the displaced persons camps to be a secondary logistical annoyance, rather than a core humanitarian responsibility under international law. This lack of accountability allowed local commanders to operate with complete impunity, treating vital life-saving supplies as private leverage over populations that had already suffered years of systematic starvation. The desperate situation grew worse every single day as the cold spring rains soaked the crowded tents. It was exactly this atmosphere of unchecked power and institutional neglect that allowed a single administrative compound near Regensburg to degenerate into a locked fortress of exploitation. Clara Johansson stood right in the center of that muddy compound, holding the evidence that would finally pierce through the official silence. Clara Johansson held her leather satchel tightly against her side as she stepped inside the warm administrative shack. Captain Morrison did not look up from his desk. He was busy cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a silver letter opener. "I have completed the inspection of the Eastern Barracks," Clara said. Morrison blew a speck of dust off his desk and looked up. "Good for you, lady. Now go back to Stockholm and tell them we are doing a grand job. The ration records do not match the empty crates in the storage yard," she said. "Records can be messy in a war zone," Morrison answered. "Your men are withholding wool blankets from families in the drafty tents," she said. "Blankets are Army property," Morrison said. "We distribute them when we see fit." "I interviewed 3 women from Kiev this morning," Clara said. "They told me your guards demanded personal favors before releasing their weekly flour bags." Morrison laughed quietly and leaned back in his leather chair. "Those people have been through a lot. They will say anything to get extra attention from an officer." "Your guards are running a black market ring with civilian medicine," she said. "My boys are working hard in the mud," Morrison answered. "They deserve to make a little profit on the side." "This is a clear violation of the Geneva Convention," Clara said. "I am documenting these extortions in my official report." Morrison stood up slowly and walked over to the iron mesh wiring. He tapped the heavy padlock with his silver letter opener. "Listen to me, Swedish lady. You do not understand how the real world works. These people are lucky to be alive at all. They should be deeply grateful for whatever scraps they get from us. We conquered this territory, which means we make the rules inside these gates. Your little notebook does not mean a damn thing out here in the mud. You are denying basic food to starving children," she said. "They are just DPs," Morrison said. "They are displaced persons who do not even belong to a real country anymore. They are not your problem, and they certainly are not my problem. My men come first, and those peasants come last. Now take your satchel and get out of my camp before I have my guards escort you to the border." Clara closed her notebook and turned toward the door. "This camp belongs to the American Third Army," she said. Morrison smiled and picked up his glass of scotch. "And the Third Army is 50 miles away," he said. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up directly to the front gate of the compound, splashing thick brown mud over the wire fence. 4 polished stars gleamed brightly on his helmet, and his iconic ivory-handled revolvers rested securely on his belt. The engine cut out, and a sudden, heavy silence fell over the entire camp as every single soldier and refugee registered his presence. The general walked into the administrative shack unannounced. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the luxury items scattered around the office. He simply kept his eyes fixed entirely on the commander. Captain Morrison stood at rigid attention, his face completely pale. "Are you the officer in charge of this camp?" Patton asked. "Yes, General," Morrison said. "Captain Frank Morrison, 3rd Army Quartermaster Detachment. Did you receive the direct orders regarding the management and protection of displaced persons?" Patton asked. "I did, General. Morris answered. Are the 600 people inside this wire under your direct care? Patton asked. They are, General, Morrison said. Did you allow your men to withhold food and blankets from these people? Patton asked. Morrison shifted his weight. General, the supply lines are thin, and we had to prioritize our own personnel. These DPs are lucky to be alive. They should be grateful for whatever they get from us. Patton studied him for a long moment. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. You were given command of 600 human beings who have already survived absolute hell. Patton said, your sole responsibility was to protect them and restore their dignity. Instead, you allowed your detachment to treat this camp as a personal fiefdom. Your men extorted them, stole their food, and abused their vulnerability. And you sat in this warm room and did absolutely nothing. General, they are just displaced persons, Morrison said. They do not have a country. Every single person in this camp is an individual under American military protection, Patton said. That makes them our absolute responsibility under the law. We fought a bloody campaign across this continent to liberate people from a regime of criminals. Your actions have turned us into another set of criminals. You have disgraced the uniform you wear, and you have compromised the honor of the entire Third Army. You have a choice, Patton said. You will either stand trial right now for your total failure of command, or you will experience exactly what you inflicted on these people. Decide now. Morrison kept his mouth shut, completely unable to find his words. General Patton turned sharply to his military police escort and gave a single, quiet command. Within 5 minutes, the iron mesh fence surrounding the supply yard was completely torn down by 3 heavy transport trucks. The local camp guards were stripped of their weapons, their polished boots, and their warm winter jackets right in front of the gathered crowd. Patton ordered the 2 soldiers who had directly extorted the refugee women to be locked inside a muddy canvas tent that had no floorboards and no blankets, completely mirroring the exact conditions they had forced upon the families for weeks. Captain Morrison was forced to stand in the freezing rain on a wooden platform, right in the center of the camp, watching his personal stash of whiskey, fur coats, and gold jewelry being distributed directly to the 600 refugees. The shivering women and children came out of their damp barracks, their eyes wide with disbelief, as they finally received their full food rations. Morrison stood completely frozen, listening to the loud cheers of the crowd, while the cold spring mud soaked through his thin wool socks. The entire compound watched in total silence as the corrupt detachment was marched out of the gates under armed guard, leaving the camp completely under the authority of a new civil affairs team. Clara Johansson returned to her native Stockholm shortly after the conclusion of the European conflict, where she spent the next 3 decades quietly working for various international humanitarian organizations. She never spoke publicly about her grueling days spent in the mud of the Regensburg compound. But her close family members noted that she kept a small, tarnished silver ring on her desk until the day she passed away in 1978. That ring was a constant, silent reminder of the absolute vulnerability she had witnessed and the cold justice that had arrived in the rain. Captain Frank Morrison faced a formal military tribunal later that same year, where his extensive black market activities and total failure of command were thoroughly documented by the Third Army prosecutor. He served 4 years in a federal penitentiary before returning to Jacksonville, Florida, where he lived out the remainder of his life in absolute obscurity, running a small retail hardware store until his death in 1969. He remained deeply bitter about his sudden disgrace, frequently complaining to his few close associates that his military career had been completely ruined by a civilian bureaucrat and a rigid commander who didn't understand the real logistics of a war zone. General Patton himself made only a single brief entry regarding the Regensburg incident in his personal diary, noting that an army which tolerates the systematic exploitation of the defenseless is an army that has already lost its moral right to victory. He firmly believed that the uniform belonged entirely to those who protected the weak, a conviction that remained absolutely unchanged until his sudden death in December of 1945. Some historians have argued that General Patton's heavy-handed intervention at the civilian compound near Regensburg was an overreach of his combat authority, claiming that frontline commanders should not have disrupted the administrative chain of command during a critical phase of the military advance. These critics suggest that a formal bureaucratic investigation would have preserved standard administrative protocols without causing friction between tactical units and local supply detachments. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that immediate, visible punishment was absolutely necessary to halt the moral decay inside the rear echelon units and to maintain the integrity of the American uniform. What is certain is that the severe directive issued after the investigation permanently transformed the inspection protocol for all regional displaced persons camps, ensuring strict institutional accountability. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have filed a standard administrative complaint up the bureaucratic chain of command? Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more stories about what soldiers found that changed them forever, make sure to subscribe.